A leaked New York Times memo reveals that the paper instructed its reporters to censor their language surrounding the conflict in Gaza.
I wanna start a revolution.
Alright guys, hello and welcome to another episode of Thinking Out Loud. We got a quick little video for you guys here today, try to keep it short. But before we jump into the video, I hope you like the new intro montage. I'm experimenting with some video editing and different aesthetics and vibes as we work on rebranding the channel, trying to up the production value, make it a little more professional without losing some of that underground charm that we have. Obviously, we're still working on thinking about, the name change. What do we want to call the channel? I know a lot of you have liked the name Media Underground that I was kind of cooking on. Some of you said it was generic. I can't say that I'd argue with that, but, with that, drop comments with any ideas you have for the name of the channel. I've had people tell me that I should just name it Dylan Daniels, Double D, something like that. I don't know. Drop a comment. Let me know what you guys think. But we're going to be moving forward with that rebrand a little at a time. We're not rushing it because, once we get that done, we're sticking with it. And that's going to be the name of the channel and the vibe and the aesthetic of the channel for the foreseeable future. We've been doing this for 5 years now. My skills as an independent journalist and an analyst and stuff like that has, I think, developed over this time. And I feel like it's time for the channel to shift gears along with that. But jumping into the video here, guys, we'll try to run it pretty quickly. We're just going to be covering one article today from The Intercept detailing a memo that was leaked by the New York Times that instructed their reporters and journalists to censor their language around the conflict in Palestine, right? And I think this is all something that we implicitly know or knew. We've seen, memes or little articles from independent journalists and third-party media outlets talking about the way in which this conflict is sort of whitewashed by the mainstream Western media, the sort of language that they use, such as, when Palestinians are killed by IDF bombs, they are killed. They're not, Palestinians died. They weren't killed, or in the rare occasions that they say that they were killed, they were killed by something we don't know, despite the clear fact that it's obviously from IOF bombing and things like that. So we all kind of know this sort of language game, this Orwellian doublespeak that the media engages in with every story. I mean, any of you that are watching this kind of content, this independent media, are aware of that, and that's why you come to independent media, so you can get actual analysis without all the tricky wording and spooky bullshit, right? But this memo that is analyzed or dissected in this Intercept article, the article itself is very fascinating because it's with all this kind of stuff. It's stuff that we know, but when we see it in writing, clear cut, plain as day like that, it's always pretty shocking, right, guys? So I'll go ahead and jump into this here for you guys. Leaked New York Times Gaza memo tells journalists to avoid words genocide, ethnic cleansing, and occupied territory. Jumping in here says, the New York Times instructed journalists covering Israel's war on the Gaza Strip to restrict the use of the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing and to avoid using the phrase occupied territory when describing Palestinian land, according to a copy of an internal memo obtained by The Intercept. The memo also instructs reporters not to use the word Palestine except in very rare cases, and to steer clear of the term refugee camps to describe areas of Gaza historically settled by displaced Palestinians expelled from other parts of Palestine during previous Israeli-Arab wars. The areas are recognized by the United Nations as refugee camps and house hundreds of thousands of registered refugees. Written by Time Standard editor Susan Westling, international editor Philip Pan, and I'm sure those emails for those two are available on the New York Times website. Usually editors, you can access them. So if you want to send a disgruntled email, I would not be against it. But yeah, guys, just jumping into the first paragraph or two here of this article, right? This is the way that media, be it in the entertainment side with Hollywood, movies, TV shows, things like that, and then obviously the news stations and stuff like that, they literally mold, they change the way that people perceive their social reality. They completely alter or warp the truth or completely obliterate the truth, not even by lying, but by omission of the truth, by the language that they choose. I mean, this is like the definition of Orwellian, but of course, it's happening in a capitalist society. And we've heard, testimonies and quotes from people like in the CIA and in the intelligence community talking about, like in the Devil's Chessboard, a lot of this stuff was brought up and dissected in that book with quotes and internal memos from the intelligence community about, we play the media. We can play the media like a mighty Wurlitzer, the mighty Wurlitzer being an instrument, right? We can play the media however we want. And a lot of this has to do with, you straight up have CIA intelligence assets in media organizations from Hollywood to CNN to all these different establishment pipelines of information, right? But more than just that, it doesn't even have to be that you have a spook in the newsroom. These news agencies, they depend on access journalism. And so if they want to get the story with public officials, diplomats from other countries, from the Pentagon, if they want to get the big breaking story and the exclusive interview, they have to toe the political line that benefits the military industrial complex. So they are going to repeat, and we see this at every single conflict, every single political, geopolitical event that happens. We see every single one of these mainstream outlets toe the line with the narrative that the State Department or the intelligence community or the Pentagon, whatever it may be, tells them to toe, right? And they do that because they want to have that access. And this is a part of that greater, dialogue that we could have with, Noam Chomsky's or, Michael Parenti even did better work on this, I feel like, of manufacturing consent, the way that, corporations, media organizations, politicians, generals, advertisers, all these things work together in this triangle samsara wheel of reincarnation almost when it comes to manufacturing consent for, what the elite want, what the ruling elite want to keep in place ideologically, right? Go ahead and pop into this more here, guys. Says, while the document is presented as an outline for maintaining objective journalistic principles and reporting on the Gaza war, several times staffers told The Intercept that some of its contents show evidence of the paper's deference to Israeli narratives. I think it's kind of thing that looks professional and logical if you have no knowledge of the historical context of the Palestinian-Israel conflict, said a Times newsroom source who requested anonymity for fear of reprisal of the Gaza memo. But if you do know, it will be clear how apologetic it is to Israel. And of course, this should be no surprise to us. Again, all these news organizations are just eating up whatever vomit the Israeli machine fucking pukes out, right? And then passes it on to us like it's news. Issuing guidance like this is to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance in how we cover the news is standard practice, says Charlie Statlander, a Times spokesperson. Across all our reporting, including complex events like this, we take care to ensure our language choices are sensitive, current, and clear to our audiences. Running a little flack here, covering the ass of the paper, obviously. In January, The Intercept reported on disputes in the Times newsroom over issues with an investigative story on systemic sexual violence on October 7th. The leak gave rise to a highly unusual internal probe. The company faced harsh criticism for allegedly targeting Times workers of Middle East and North African descent, which Times brass denied. So with this, guys, of course, you've heard this story. We have covered it on this channel. You've probably heard of it from other independent media outlets as well. The stories that came out around October 7th of when Hamas came over the wall, that they committed mass sexual assault crimes, that they used sexual assault as a weapon of war, right? And we saw, the IDF and the Israeli government running this narrative, right? And then it was just picked up, and all of this atrocity porn propaganda was just picked up by our news media. Obviously, like I said, they regurgitate what Israel says. But as time went on, as weeks and months went on, we saw this narrative, particularly around the sexual assault claims, be completely dismantled from groups like the Gray Zone, like Mondo Weiss, and then later, obviously, even more mainstream outlets like The Intercept that we have here, completely picking this apart. And this resulted in not just people calling out the Times, but workers in the Times, like we saw with this internal New York Times source, not standing for it, having an internal insurgency within the paper, calling out the paper for its role in manufacturing consent for this war and not accurately reporting the facts, right? Or not having an actual unbiased position, but quite clearly going into the mainstream narrative that U.S. and Israeli officials want us to have, right? And we have seen this going on and escalating within the paper. And I just think it's a big deal because it also goes along with the sort of insurgencies that we're seeing, like in the State Department. How many State Department officials have we seen resign in the Biden administration over this? Same with people in other NGOs and stuff. There's a mass insurgency at all levels of society, from the lowest on the street to some of the higher officials in the government and in our institutions like the media, resisting this clear cover for genocide. And it's really powerful stuff, and it should give us hope that we're moving in the right direction, even if, of course, as always, it never happens as soon as we'd like to see it, right? Going on here, guys, says, WhatsApp debate. Some staffers said they believe the paper was going out of its way to defer to Israel's narratives on the events and was not applying even standards in its coverage. Arguments being fomented on internal Slack and other chat groups. Words like slaughter. The Times memo outlines guidance on a range of phrases and terms. The nature of the conflict has led to inflammatory language and incendiary accusations on all sides. We should be very cautious about using such language, even in quotations. Our goal is to provide clear, accurate information, and heated language can often obscure rather than clarify the fact, the memo says. Words like slaughter, massacre, and carnage often convey more emotion than information. Think hard about using them in our own voice, according to the memo. Can we articulate why we are applying those words to one particular situation and not another? As always, we should focus on clarity and precision. Describe what happened rather than using a label. So this is a part of U.S. media, Western media in particular, that's really kind of an anomaly when it comes to media coverage around the world. Is in the United States in particular, news media is very strictly formatted. Like the sort of language that you're allowed to use, you're only really allowed to report the bare facts, right? And culturally in the U.S., that's perceived as a positive thing, as unbiased journalism. But at the end of the day, it actually has a tendency to muddy the waters, because if we get down to it, if we get down to core human values, there is right and wrong. Unprovoked state violence is always going to be wrong, right? Things like what's happening in Gaza, people being displaced, crimes happening that are against international law, despite it being a quote-unquote war zone. These things are morally wrong, and they're not just morally wrong, they are legally wrong on the international stage. And so a lot of times this cultural, unbiased, quote-unquote, objectivity of Western media has a tendency, by its very legalese nature, to muddy the waters, because when you just report the facts, and as we see here with their language, they don't even just report the facts, they admit truths or they bend truths, you're taking the humanity out of the issue, and therefore, mitigating the emotional human response that people should have to these sort of crimes, to these sort of political upheavals and things like that, right? Going in here, more guys says, Despite the memo's framing as an effort to not employ incendiary language to describe killings on all sides, in the Times reporting on the Gaza war, such language has been used repeatedly to describe attacks against Israelis by Palestinians, and almost never in the case of Israel's large-scale killing of Palestinians. In January, The Intercept published an analysis of New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times coverage of the war from October 7th through November 24th, a period mostly before the New Times guidance was issued. The Intercept analysis showed that the major newspapers reserved items like slaughter, massacre, and horrific almost exclusively for Israeli civilians killed by Palestinians, rather than for Palestinian civilians killed in Israeli attacks. The analysis found that as of November 24th, the New York Times had described Israeli deaths as a massacre on 58 occasions, and those of Palestinians just once. The ratio for the use of slaughter was 22-1, even as a documented number of Palestinians killed climbed to around 15,000. So, of course, no surprise here. This is that double standard laid out for us all to see in an internal memo set alongside in an analysis, right? They say in this memo that we don't want to use any of these words about Palestine or whatever. We don't even want to use the word Palestine, right? This is that manufacturing of consent. There is no Palestinian people. Erase the Palestinian people. There is only Israel, right? But we see this double standard clear as day in their reporting. They say that in this memo that they're doing this for objectivity, but then they will use all those words that they said not to use with these specific presets for the Palestinian cause, but they will use them for Israelis. And we see this all the time in media. We saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Afghanistan, we've seen it in every single war, right? And it's a particularly egregious occasion with what's going on in Palestine, because we've had less than 2,000 Israelis killed with what happened on October 7th. And as we've seen, a lot of that number seems to be inflated because of the fact that the IOF, using the Hannibal Directive, killed a lot of their own people. They just went on a free-for-all to try to make a point and gunning people down from helicopters, Hellfire missiles, burning people alive in their cars. So, a lot of that death that was supposedly caused by Hamas was actually caused by the IOF itself, killing its own people. But it's so egregious to see this with Palestine because, they'll use a slaughter, horrific, all these terms for what happened to Israel. And yes, you can say that was horrific. War is horrific. People resisting colonization sometimes do horrible crimes. We're not whitewashing that. Violence is violence. But they won't use any of those words, or try to almost never use those words, when we have almost 40,000 people, Palestinians, killed, half of them children. I mean, it's this clear division of humanity, this clear, can't talk today, guys, apologize, altering, shaping of people's perception of reality, right? And that's the power of the mainstream media, right? Touchy debates. It is accurate to use terrorism and terrorists in describing the attacks of October 7th, which included the deliberate targeting of civilians and killings and kidnappings, according to the Leaked Times memo. We should not shy away from that description of the events or the attackers, particularly when we provide context and explanation. The guidance also instructs journalists to avoid fighters when referring to October 7th attack. The term suggests a conventional war rather than a deliberate attack on civilians. And be cautious in using militants, which is interpreted in different ways and may be confusing to readers. In the memo, the editors tell Times journalists, we do not need to assign a single label to refer to the October 7th assault as a terrorist attack in every reference. The word is best used when specifically describing attacks on civilians. We should exercise restraint and can vary the language with other accurate terms and descriptions: an attack, an assault, an incursion, the deadliest attack in Israel in decades, etc. Similarly, in addition to terrorists, we can vary the terms used to describe the Hamas members who carried out the assault: attackers, assailants, gunmen. And it's important to remember, things did happen with civilians, of course, on October 7th at the hands of Hamas. But we know that the purpose of what Hamas was trying to do was to attack military targets and hopefully take high-value military hostages, right? And along the way, they got everyone that they could. And you can have your opinions on right or wrong, right, in the context of a colonial war, right? But I just want to point out that using the term terrorist for this is maybe not the best. I mean, a better term might be partisans. And like they noted here, militants would actually be a much better term, because these aren't terrorists whose sole purpose and intent is to attack civilian targets. A good example of terrorism would be what Israel is doing right now: bombing apartment buildings, bombing schools, bombing colleges, bombing hospitals, killing aid workers systematically. And we talked in our last episode how they have documents. The IOF has documents outlining rules of engagement for war crimes like attacking aid workers. That's a war crime, and they have clear chain of command for how to commit a war crime. And obviously, very similar context with the Hannibal Directive. Killing their own civilians. Killing civilians is a war crime, obviously. But I think a better term when it comes to Hamas is indeed the militants, the partisans, because these are people, through whatever means, are resisting colonial domination, resisting ethnic cleansing, resisting genocide, right? And they are saying, no ifs, ands, or buts, you can use the word terrorist when it comes to these people, because that is the narrative that they want. These aren't freedom fighters. These aren't militants. These aren't legitimate people in a legitimate military political organization. They're just terrorists. They're just crazy people. They're just crazy brown fucking Arabs. That's the narrative they want, and it's all subterfuge, right? Let's go on here. The Times does not characterize Israel's repeated attacks on Palestinian civilians as terrorism, even when civilians have been targeted. This is also true of Israel's assaults on protected civilian sites, including hospitals, like we were just saying there. Double standard. Use terrorists for the Browns. When it comes to the white people in the Israel settler colony, do not use that word. Doesn't matter how many people they've killed. Even though it's clearly a war of terror. They have done very little to actually take down Hamas. You know, we've heard reports that from Israeli and U.S. Intelligence assets saying that about 30% of Hamas is defeated. And then we've heard reporting out of Al Jazeera through different proxies like Hezbollah saying that it's only about 10%. So, you know, if we want to be fair, we could say that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and let's go with only in 6 months, only 15 to 20% of the current Hamas militants, not those that are being actively trained and enrolled into battalions and stuff like that, have been killed. That is not defeating Hamas, right? That is not winning. This whole war has been actively about killing civilians to make a fucking statement, to shock and awe victory, really. But you're not actually achieving any political objective. That is the point of war. The point of war, to win a war, you have to achieve your political objectives, be they dismantling a military organization, be they bending a state or government to the will of another state or government, right? Clearly a war of terror. Let's go on here, guys. Says, in a section with the headline genocide and other incendiary language, the guidance says genocide has a specific definition in international law. In our own voice, we should generally use it only in the context of those legal parameters. We should also set a high bar for allowing others to use it as an accusation, whether in quotations or not, unless they are making a substantive argument based on the legal definition. Regarding ethnic cleansing, the document calls it another historically charged term, instructing reporters if someone is making such an accusation, we should press for specifics or supply proper context. We have had countless UN officials, countless NGO officials, countless foreign government officials, the entire spectrum of state and civil society around the world, except for in the West, call this a genocide. And here they are saying, try your very best to never use any of these words: genocide, ethnic cleansing, things like that, right? Bucking international norms. In the case of describing occupied territory and the status of refugees in Gaza, the Times Style Guidelines runs counter to norms established by the United Nations in international humanitarian law. On the term Palestine, a widely used name for both the territory and the UN-recognized state, the Times memo contains blunt instructions. Do not use in datelines, routine text, or headlines, except in very rare cases such as when the United Nations General Assembly elevated Palestine to a non-member observer state, or references to historic Palestine. The Times guidance resembles that of the Associated Press style book. The memo directs journalists not to use the phrase refugee camps to describe long-standing refugee settlements in Gaza. While termed refugee camps, the refugee centers in Gaza are developed and densely populated neighborhoods dating back to 1948. Refer to them as neighborhoods or areas, and if further context is necessary, explain how they have been historically been called refugee camps. This is so clearly a utter disregard, bending, warping, manipulation of the truth. The international community recognizes Palestinians as internationally protected refugees. It recognizes the region that Israel calls Israel as Palestine. This is Palestine. These are Palestinian refugees. These are refugee camps. This is what every nation almost on earth and every NGO and the entire body of the UN perceives this as. This is the objective truth of collective humanity coming together. But they completely mitigate that by warping the language that they use with the public. How Orwellian can you get? Again, I don't know how many times I want to say Orwellian, but I don't know what other word to use. I fucking hate Orwell myself. But he was on point with his perception, or his rendition of a militarized police state propaganda apparatus, right? It's a perfect term to use for the U.S. mainstream media. Let's go on here. The United Nations recognizes 8 refugees camps in the Gaza Strip. So again, and it recognizes 600,000 refugees. This is international law. This is standard. And our news media in this country, particularly the New York Times, just washes that away to shape the way people think. They're wiring people's brains, and it's horrifying because it works. The Israeli government has long been hostile to the historical fact that Palestinians maintain refugee status. The memo's instruction on the use of occupied territory says, when possible, avoid the term and be specific, Gaza and West Bank instead of occupied territories, as each has a slightly different status. The United Nations, along with much of the world, considers Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem to be occupied Palestinian territories seized by Israel in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Occupied territories. The whole world recognizes the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as occupied territories. Territories where the IOF, the Israeli military, is at, and they are not supposed to be at, and they're supposed to, if they are there, they have to follow very strict guidelines for occupation forces, which they completely flout, especially when they build settlements in East Jerusalem along the edges of the Gaza Strip, and then the West Bank, right? Completely mitigating their responsibilities as an occupier. The admission against the use of the term occupied territories, said a Times staffer, obscures the reality of the conflict, feeding into the U.S. and Israeli insistence that the conflict began October 7th. You are basically taking the occupation out of the coverage, which is the actual core of the conflict, said the newsroom source. It's like, oh, let's not say occupation because it might make it look like we're justifying a terrorist attack. So that's it for this article, guys. I'm going to go ahead and shut this down. But obviously, this article is great. Kudos to the whistleblowers that leaked this information and those New York Times staffers that are actually speaking out in favor of actual freedom of speech, in favor of actual journalism, actual reporting. It's really powerful stuff to see people from all sectors of society resisting this occupation, resisting the lies that surround this occupation. But yeah, guys, that's all I have for you. Don't forget to like. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to drop those comments with ideas for a new name for the channel. Get my wheels cooking. Get my brain lubricated. And don't forget, you can support our independent media work on Patreon at patreon.com/entitledmillennials, which may be changing in the near future, obviously. Or you can support our independent media work with a one-time donation through PayPal at paypal.me/entitledmillennials. I really appreciate all that financial support, guys, especially with all these new equipment upgrades. My bank account is shot, so hope to see those. Really appreciate it. And as always, guys, great hanging out with you. Love talking the issues with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you all real soon. Bye-bye for now.
I wanna start a revolution.